All right, let's get into it. Today we're tackling a massive topic, justice. What we're going to do is take some pretty dense moral philosophy and, boil it down into a clear guide for figuring out what's fair and what's right. So let's dive in and see if we can build our own philosophy of justice.
Okay, let's start with a thought experiment. Just imagine for a second you have a completely blank slate. You get to design society from the ground up. What's the number one most important rule you would put in place to make sure it's fair for everybody? It's a huge question, right? But it's the exact problem that philosophers have been wrestling with for centuries.
And, one of the most famous attempts to answer that question came from a philosopher named John Rawls. And he wasn't just thinking about one rule. No, he wanted to create an entire blueprint for a perfectly just society, one that's really built on a foundation of fairness.
So how did he do it? Well, he came up with this really cool hypothetical scenario he called the original position. Just picture a group of smart, rational people getting together to write the rule book for society. But there's a catch, and trust me, it's a big one.
Rawls called this catch the veil of ignorance. Here's how it works. While you're making all the rules, you have absolutely no idea who you're going to be in this new society. You don't know if you'll be rich or poor, your gender, your race, nothing. And that right there is the key. It forces you to be impartial, because you have to make the fairest possible rules, knowing you could easily end up as the most vulnerable person living under them.
So, Rawls argued that anybody in this original position would naturally agree on two big principles. First, everyone gets the same basic liberties. Stuff like free speech and due process, non-negotiable. Second, any social or economic inequalities are only acceptable if they're set up to give the greatest possible benefit to the people at the very bottom. The takeaway here is really powerful. For Rawls, justice isn't about everyone being perfectly equal. It's about making sure that any inequalities that do exist actually help lift up those who need it most.
Okay, so Rawls gives us this incredible ideal, this blueprint. But in the messy real world, how do people actually decide what's right and wrong? Well, let's look at three major ethical frameworks that kind of act like different moral operating systems, especially when we're talking about criminal justice. Each of these frameworks tries to answer the question, what's the right thing to do? But they do it in completely different ways. Utilitarianism is all about the outcome. It asks, what action will create the greatest good for the greatest number of people? Then you've got deontology. It doesn't care about outcomes. It asks, what are the universal rules? What are my duties? And finally, virtue ethics takes a different route entirely and asks, what would a good virtuous person do in this spot? It's all about character.
And this right here really gets to the core conflict, especially between those first two. You can see it playing out all the time. For a utilitarian, the ends might justify the means if it leads to the greater good. But for a deontologist, no way. The means are everything. There are certain unbreakable rules, like protecting individual rights, that you just can't violate no matter what the potential outcome is.
But hey, the conversation doesn't just stop with those big three. There are other important ways of looking at these problems, other ethical lenses that give us a much more complete picture of moral dilemmas, especially in the justice system.
For instance, there's the ethics of care, which says we should focus on empathy and relationships. It's super important in areas like juvenile justice. Then you have ethical egoism, which is a bit more cynical, suggesting we all just act in our own self-interest. But even that's useful, maybe for designing systems to prevent corruption. And of course, there's divine command theory, which says morality comes from God or a higher power, and that shapes the personal compass for millions of people.
So with all these different viewpoints, it raises a huge question, doesn't it? Is there one single right way to think about justice for everyone? Or does it all just depend on where you live and what your culture is? In other words, is morality universal or is it relative?
And this brings us right to a central debate in philosophy. On one side, you've got moral relativism. This idea says that moral standards are just defined by culture. There's no universal truth. Justice is local. But on the other side, you have the belief in universal principles. The idea that, certain rights, like the right to be treated with dignity, apply to every single person, everywhere, no matter what.
And here's why this isn't just an academic debate. This stuff really, really matters. I mean, think about it. If you accept total moral relativism, that everything is just cultural, then on what basis can we condemn things like human rights abuses happening in another country? This is the massive challenge that relativism presents. Without some kind of universal standard, the whole idea of a human right starts to fall apart.
So where does all this leave us? It might feel like a big, confusing mess of competing ideas. But actually, the strongest, most useful philosophy of justice probably doesn't just pick one of these theories and throw the rest out. Instead, it pulls the best parts from each one to build a really solid moral compass.
Yeah, think of it like building an ethical toolkit. From Rawls, we get our foundation. Fairness is everything. Deontology gives us our bright lines. Respect for individual rights is non-negotiable. Utilitarianism makes us be practical. Consequences do matter for public safety. Virtue ethics reminds us that the character of the people in the system is crucial. And finally, the ethics of care ensures we never, ever forget the real human impact behind every decision.
So I'll leave you with this to think about. When the pressure is really on, when you have to make a hard call, which part of your moral compass points true north? What's the principle you won't compromise on? Figuring that out is the real first step to building a philosophy of justice that is strong, humane, and ready for whatever the world throws at it.